コロキウムを開始したいと思います。今日はオックスフォード大学のベアケ・フレリスビック先生によるお話になります。今日は4時40分までのお話になりますけれども、最初は先生の方からお話しいただいて、その後質問に入りたいと思います。で、司会の方は日本語でも大丈夫だというふうに時々先生だけ言いますので、司会の方は日本語で進めたいと思いますが、発表は英語で、次の方も英語も交えていただいて結構かと思います。じゃあ、よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much, Professor Onishi, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here today. I'm looking forward to this. I've been told to look into that camera and speak into that microphone, so I'll do my very best to do those things. Before really starting, I would like to say that I've known Onishi sensei since 1990 when I visited the Kokuoken in Kitaku at that time, so quite a long time ago. So I'm very grateful that you could be here today. The title of my talk is, as it says on the slide, on the uses of the imperative, prohibitive, and optative verb forms in Old Japanese. And this refers to a set of verb forms which were found in Old Japanese, the Japanese of the 8th century, which are on the slide here. These forms are generally termed, and that's what's referred to in the title, imperative, prohibitive, and either optative or desiderative. It refers to the forms that are on the slide here, forms like nakye, sing, imperative, nanaki so, don't sing, prohibitive, and then the forms that are below that, nakanamu, kikana, kudasane, and I'll be introducing those forms as we go along. I will discuss the grammatical properties of these forms and the functions they had in Old Japanese, both in terms of what is common to them and therefore what sets them off from other forms and other constructions, and also how they differ from each other. In doing that, I will draw towards the end of the talk on notions of linguistic function from the tradition of Carl Bühler and Roman Jakobson, who were European linguists. I'll mention their dates later. Particularly in terms of the model of verbal communication that Bühler proposed and which was further developed by Roman Jakobson. I will not, to any extent, talk about the morphophonology of these forms, so how they are formed, how we can account for the shape they have, their etymology, what might be their origin, diachronic changes in this system since Old Japanese, and finally, what is sometimes called how to do things with words. That is, how to express particular meanings or speech acts in Old Japanese. I'll focus on these forms and the functions they had. The outline of the talk is as shown here, and I'll start with a tiny bit of background on Old Japanese. I don't think it's so important in this forum, but just to make sure, Old Japanese is the language of the 8th century. In Japanese, it's what we refer to as Jōdaigo, and that's the language we're talking about. So it's a language that does not have a lot of text. Estimate is around just over 100,000 words, 110, 20,000 words, which is not a large amount of material, other than the fact that there isn't an awful lot of material and the fact that it's a dead language, so we can't consult speakers about what they might have meant when they said something. We only have the written form. The quality of the material also presents challenges. Most of the texts are poetry, and of course poetry presents particular linguistic modes of expression. For the purpose of what I'm talking about today, I think that's actually an advantage because we find exemplification of language usage that we might not otherwise find so frequently in other kinds of expository language. And in addition, there's a lot of formulaic language, ritualized language with repeated material, and there's a lot of set phrases. So it's not a very large amount of material to work with, but of course it is what we have, and therefore we make the most of what we have. Finally, it's written in a mixture of logographic and phonographic writing. All of it is written in kanji, of course, since the kana letters had not evolved by that time. And finally, accessibility of the material I put there is a challenge, and that's because until fairly recently, it required quite a large amount of philological training and detailed text work from books to work with this material. But that has somewhat been made easier today by this corpus and, for example, the corpus of historical Japanese, which is also here at NINJAL, but the one I have based this on is what we call the Oxford NINJAL Corpus of Old Japanese, so usually abbreviated ONCOJ. It's co-hosted by us at Oxford and by the Kokuoken here, and also with contribution from Hirosaki University, where Professor Alistair Butler is. And that's what I have used to access the material and draw on the example, or draw the examples from that I'll be presenting. Well, just leave that slide there. I expect some people here will be familiar with the ONCOJ. It's a digital corpus that has been, which presents both original script and a phonemic transcription. It's heavily parsed and annotated for both morphology, but also syntactic constituency. It has an associated Old Japanese to English dictionary, which is quite rudimentary, but very helpful, since there is no other Old Japanese to English dictionary. And then it also gradually presents translations of the text into English, which make the text a lot easier to work with for those who do not have extensive philological training, which means it's more accessible for general linguists with an interest in Old Japanese. I'll now briefly introduce the three sets of forms that I'll be talking about, and then after that, talk in more detail about each one. The imperative is, well, what it says. It's an imperative form where you, traditionally that's described as a form you use to issue commands to people. Here, for example, an example, lend me a boat, pune kase. We know this, of course, exactly the same from modern Japanese. The prohibitive issues a prohibition, a negative command. So, waka koromo, pito ni nakiseso, don't let anyone else wear my clothes. Just a word on the examples. The base of the examples is the transcription into a phonemic transcription, so in the Latin alphabet. But as many people are not used to seeing Old Japanese written that way, I also included the original script in the first line, and then in the second line, a simple katakana transcription in something like the historical kana spelling, which I hope will make the examples more easily accessible to those who are not used to seeing Old Japanese in Romanized script. Another way of expressing the prohibitive is in the third example. Same kind of general meaning, says katami no mono wo pito ni shimeasu na. Don't show this keepsake to anyone. So a very similar example. And finally, the optatives, I'll get to the conclusion that this is not a very good word for these forms when we get to the end of the talk, but they are usually talked about in that way. In Japanese, the word is either gambo or kibo, or something like that for these verb endings. In the first example, na, ne in the next one, and then namu in the third one. Those are the three different types of optatives. And they have meanings that are often, uses that are often translated this way. Ware sape nure na, I wish I too would get wet. Or kiepu, so today, kiepu pa kurasane, spend today in what says tubadaka ni, merrily. I hope you will spend today, I wish you will spend today in a merry way. And then the last example, magi mo kwo pa koromo ni aranamu, I wish my beloved were a garment, a piece of clothes. So that's sort of typical examples presented of these forms. And I'll talk somewhat more about them individually, but that's the general overview. Here is a chart showing what the forms look like. The first column on the left has the Old Japanese forms, the labels that are usually attached to them, and then examples of the forms. As I said, I won't talk much about the actual appearance of the forms, but about their functions. I also listed the corresponding forms in early Middle Japanese, or Heian Japanese, and in modern Japanese. And as you can see, some of the forms, most of these forms don't survive into the modern language, and some of them don't survive into Heian Japanese, into early Middle Japanese. Again, that's not something I will talk much about, but it's something worth considering that Old Japanese exhibits this somewhat more elaborate set of forms, and I think a very interesting system. This is an overview over what the forms more specifically look like in Old Japanese, because there are different classes of verb and they look slightly different in these forms. But again, it's not going to be any kind of focus of what I'm talking about. I've also, though, put in here how many examples of each form we have in the ONCOJ, the corpus of Old Japanese. So you can see it's not many instantiations. There are 333 examples of imperative forms, 145 of prohibitive forms, and 156 of optative forms. I should say, just going back one slide, that I will not really be including the prohibitive form that ends in na. It is seemingly a younger form than the older forms that have na before the verb. But for convenience, I'm excluding the forms that have na at the end, so yuku na, which are the forms we find in modern Japanese as well. They don't seem to behave any differently, but they won't figure in the examples that follow. These three sets of forms have some shared features which does set them off as a clear set of forms which is distinct from declaratives and interrogatives, and so they make up some kind of sentence type and probably one or more moods that are different from indicative mood. They are not used in constructions with focus particles. That's a very big difference from declaratives and interrogatives, which routinely have kakarimusubi included in forms with these in these sentences. There's no kakarimusubi. There's no question words. These forms cannot occur in questions, and that does set them off functionally from the other forms. They're not used with tense marking, so you can't put them in the past tense. They're not used with any kind of modality marking, which may not be surprising as they express some kind of mood, and they're not used with negation marking. Of course, the prohibitive is an exception, is different because that includes a negation as it is, but the optatives and the imperative cannot be used with negation. Finally, it's also interesting that as opposed to the forms that are used in declaratives and interrogatives, these forms cannot be relativized, they cannot be used in relative clauses, they cannot be nominalized, and they cannot be subordinated, with one important exception, which we'll talk about. So there is something about this set of forms that really sets them off from other sentence types in the language. They are very often the sentences with these forms construed with explicit either vocatives or subjects, such as in 7, Watari mori pune paya watase, ferryman, please or take the boat across quickly. So there's an explicit vocative and or subject in these sentences. In about half of the examples, it depends a little bit. So in half of the sentences with an imperative verb form, there is such an explicit vocative or subject expressed. Sometimes, as here, it occurs before the verb, and sometimes that element is right dislocated, occurs after the verb. So, Yadwo no akipagui mini ko wagaseko, which again is a very, I think, unsurprising construction also for modern Japanese. These explicit vocatives or subjects are mostly bare in the sense that do not occur with any particle after them. So bare in the sense that they just occur on their own. Sometimes they occur with a particle. In very, very few cases with a vocative interjectional particle like yo, that's very, very rare. Mostly if there is a particle, it's pa, which is the precursor of modern Japanese wa. They never occur with any kind of case marking particle like ga or no. So it's not that we can tell anything about the syntactic function from marking on them. And that's important because I keep referring to them as vocatives or subjects, and that will be an issue later, whether they are one or the other. And sometimes they are one and sometimes they are the other. There is one example I've come across where we have both a vocative and a subject. This one here, Potorokisu nare dani kinake. Koku, you come and sing. So we seem to have both a vocative, the Potorokisu, and then the pronoun nare in the same example. But that is, I think, the only example where they co-occur. So that's what's common to all of these forms in terms of certain distributional facts. And I'll now talk about the forms individually, starting with the imperative and prohibitive, and then going on to the optatives. The imperative, most examples, unsurprisingly, have a human or highly animate vocative or subject and are construed with volitional verbs. That makes sense. Normally, if you ask people to do something, it's something that they have the volition to do. So the verb will be volitional. And it's usually people you ask to do things. So that's kind of what a canonical imperative is like. A human or highly animate subject that you ask to do something that they are able to do, have volition to do. There are some non-human vocative subjects, but here, like you saw just before, you can ask a koku here, yama hotorokisu, to do something. That is not surprising. Another couple of examples. These are the examples we looked at before. On the whole, you will find that I repeat some of the examples as we go along, partly because once we're familiar with an example, it's easier to look at that rather than have to become familiar with a new example every time there is a point to make. This is simply to give more examples of volitional verbs with a human or highly animate subject. Sometimes overtly expressed, as in 15, sometimes not overtly expressed, as in 14. However, we also have non-volitional verbs in imperative constructions, which again is not surprising because we find that in many languages, which is probably why it's not surprising. But get fat. Logically, you can't ask somebody to get fat because you don't have any volition over whether you get fat. You can probably affect it by your behavior, but you can't get fat the same way you can lend somebody something. Yeah. And that's something that's worth just keeping in mind. But also examples like 17, please be unchanged. So tokipa ni imase, my precious Lord, tapu toki waka kimi. That is clearly not something that you have volition over. So it is not really a command. Yeah, and we find this in most other languages and also in modern Japanese. So we don't find that surprising. But again, it does mean we have to factor that in, that commands are not just about something that the person or the thing we are commanding do something has volition over. We also have inanimate subjects, and I really don't think they can be construed in many cases as vocatives. Here there's the yanagui, willow trees. May the willow trees grow. Yanagui mori ni paya nare, grow into a forest. I don't think, if you look at translations of these poems into modern Japanese, the translators very often translate these as vocatives where you are commanding or requesting the willow tree to do something. I think that is very unlikely. I think this means may the willow tree quickly grow into something. And that's very different from saying, willow tree, you grow into something. Yeah. The same with the momiti in number 19, may they quickly follow on. And that's where this distinction between vocative and subject does become relevant and significant. Here, the final example of this kind is from one of the Busoksekika, which is talking about the footprints of the Buddha, the Busokseki, and says, Sana kori imase. There's no way we can construe that as a vocative, asking the footprints to remain for a long time. So this means, may they remain forever. And that's an aspect of the imperative which is not always overtly addressed, I think. Turn now to prohibitives, which is negative imperatives. There are the examples we saw before with the example in 21 repeated here, of a human, strongly animate subject like you. It's not expressed overtly, but it's very clearly addressed to a human. And a volitional verb, with the verb here being to let somebody wear clothes, and here it's in the prohibitive, na kiseso. There are also other verbs which are not volitional in the same sense, but we are probably not surprised by finding na quo puiso wagimo, don't yearn so much. You can say that, don't be sad. We don't take any kind of exception to that. Although it's obviously not something you have control over, whether you're sad or not. We also find, though, things that are very different. Examples like arashi napukiso, don't let there be a storm. That's not a command to the arashi of not to blow. Shipopui, the ebb tide, shioi, na arisone, let there not be a low tide. Again, it's clearly not a command. So the prohibitive, the negative imperative, has this aspect to its use as the morphological imperative does. Kono yo na akeso, don't let this night dawn. It's not a command to the night not to dawn. I mentioned that these forms cannot be subordinated, but there is an important exception to that, which is very interesting, namely that they can be embedded with the complementizer to in two kinds of situations. One is completely unremarkable, namely that you can have directly reported speech. He said, don't do something. And number 26 is an example like that. That because they said, katarapi sudeba, paya kapieriko, come back quickly. That's completely normal for an imperative, that you can have it as directly reported speech. And that's not really syntactic embedding in the same way. However, the imperatives can also be used, and the prohibitives, and in a few cases, some of the optatives, as arguments of verbs of praying and things like that. And the one I find the most interesting is purpose adjuncts for a range of predicates, and we'll look at a few examples of what I mean by this. Arguments of verbs of praying, here in 27, the subject of the verb kopinomi is the mother of somebody called Tatsumaro, who the poem is about. She prayed to the gods that he be safe. There's no address involved in this. She prayed that he may be safe. And so that's the type of embedding where we don't find the imperative meaning that we normally associate with an imperative, and we'll get to that. Another example is 28, inori mawoshite, praying that my wife wait for me. So I'm not praying to my wife, I'm not telling my wife something, I'm praying that she wait for me. And that is expressed with the morphological imperative form, subordinated and embedded with to. And then the next one is embedding as non-controlled purpose, which means in order that something happen. So here is the carnations, the nadeshiko, which my imoga ueshi, which my beloved planted, so that I may long for her. And non-controlled purpose means that it's as opposed to a controlled purpose situation where you say, I went to the shop to buy clothes in order to buy clothes, where I'm also the subject of the other verb. Here we have an independent clause, which is the purpose. So she planted these Nadesco, which she planted so that I might long for her. Another example here, tukui pa teru rashi, the moon seems to be shining, so that I clearly can see the dew that is on the bush clover that my darling uses for hair decoration. But again, this is not a way of using the imperative that we find in many other languages. Embedded in this way, there's no imperative sense. There is a directive sense, a purpose sense, but there's no imperative sense involved. And this one is probably my favorite of these examples. It is about ducks. Even ducks are said to brush and interweave their feathers when they're sleeping so that frost won't fall on their tails. So they do this, sashikapete uti padapi, so that there will not be frost on their tails. Very clearly a non-control purpose construction using the imperative form here. And I'll try and tell you later why I think this is significant for trying to understand what the basic meaning of these forms is. Turning to the optatives, as I mentioned, there are three forms that differ from each other, not the way that different forms of the imperative differs by phonological reasons, but that are morphologically distinct. And one of them ends in na, one of them in ne, and one of them in namu. And here are some examples. We'll look at more examples presently, but just to mention that it's usually said that the difference between these forms is that the form that ends in na has a first-person subject, so I wish I would get wet. The form that ends in ne has a second-person subject, may you spend the time in some way here. And the form that ends in namu has a third-person subject. This is to some extent true, but it's not really the core of what these forms do or express. Looking first at the one that ends in namu, the one that usually has a third-person subject, that is indeed true. It is wishes about something happening, very often with something either will happen or it would have been good if it had happened. So it's an irrealis wish. It's something that is not realized and either is unlikely to be realized in the future or it was not realized in the past. But here, I wish the bush warbler would sing. It could happen, but it's also very likely that it won't. In 36, kumo danimo kokoro aranamo. I wish the clouds were compassionate, but they're not. They are there. They do obscure the moon. I wish the night would be long. Yo nagaku aranamu. Or koyoi payamo akenamu. I wish the night would dawn quickly. Or the last one, wakimo kwopa koromo ni aranamu. Looked at that one before. If only my beloved were a garment, but of course she's not. First of all, there are very few of the examples of these forms that are in namu. So what we can say about them is a little bit tentative, but there are a few among these few examples that do not have third-person subjects, and this is one that's fairly clear. Matopoku no ni nimo apanamu. I wish, or if only we would meet or had met in a distant field, so where people can't see us. The subject is either we, or it could be I or you, but it's certainly not a third-person subject. There's no explicit subject here. So this is an example of the optative namu that has a non-third-person subject. So what's core to it is really not that it has a third person subject, but that it expresses a wish about something that probably won't happen or that didn't happen. Often accompanied by, if only something had happened, then something else could have happened. But the first thing didn't happen, and therefore the second thing didn't happen either. Turning to the ones in na, they indeed mostly have first-person subjects in one way or another. Most of the verbs that are found with this form are volitional, and some are non-volitional. Here, I think we've looked at both of these. Nurasana, I would like to wet, to make wet the hem of my skirt, mo suso. Or in 40, I would like to get wet myself. But actually, when we look at the whole range of these examples, the more common situation is that there is a first and second person subject, rather than just a first person singular subject. So examples like waga sekwo pana kadura sena is very typical of the use of this form that ends in na. And it means let us wear flower crowns, pana kadura, my dear friends. Other examples which are similar, both in actual lexical items, but also in overall meaning. 42, let's warite break off and decorate our hair with the first flowers of the bush clover. And 43, wade pa musubana, let us bind together branches of pine as a fun activity. So these meanings, when there is a first and a second person subject, are very similar to what we would call a hortative meaning, an encouragement to us to do something. The form that ends in ne, this example we've seen, kuras, spend time. May you please spend today merrily, my fine friends. Second person subject and volitional verbs. And more examples. 45, ukabiga tomo, keepers of cormorants, these birds. Kone, come, imani sukeni, to help us now. And in 46, waga sekwo, swode wo purasane, my dear, please wave your sleeve. I'll skip 47, is the same thing, a volitional verb and a second person subject. But there are also non-volitional verbs. Kiapuno arojipa, so the hosts of today. Tune ni imasane, please stay unchanged, please stay the way you are forever or for a long time. Tune. So, third person subjects. Amano shidakumo, amemo tamapane, may the white clouds of heaven grant us rain. Or in 50, shida tutuji, white azalea, wade ni nipopane, may the white azalea rub their color off on my clothes. So that's actually the same pattern exactly that we found with the imperative. And so these forms that end in ne, rather than having a wishing function, is functionally far more like the imperative form in its use and its meaning. And if you look at the two examples, 51 and 52, where 51 has the morphological imperative, it's exactly the same kind of construction as in 52, which has the morphological optative that ends in ne. So, summarizing these uses, I've tried to do that in a chart here, which includes both verb volitionality and subject of the verb. And I've grouped them a little bit differently than at the beginning because the form that ends in ne has actually exactly the same function as the morphological imperative. And they share the fact that many examples have second-person subjects with volitional verbs, and in that case it means something that we can paraphrase as I order or urge or request you to do something, which is the kind of meaning we associate with imperatives. They can have second-person subjects with non-volitional verbs, in which case it means something, may something be the case, may you be in a certain way, but something that the subject does not have any control, any volition over. And third-person subjects with non-volitional verbs, so may the clouds give us rain. Not a command to the clouds, but some kind of, what we in English can express as may or let something happen. So that's one group. Then there's the form that ends in na, which in certainly well over half of the examples have a joint first and second person subject with volitional verbs, which has the meaning of let's do something. Let's have fun in some particular way. But it can also be used with a first person singular subject and with verbs that are either volitional or non-volitional, in which case they mean I'll do something or let me do something. And finally, the form that ends in namu, mostly third person subjects with either non-volitional or volitional verbs. There's probably a higher frequency of non-volitional verbs, but there certainly also are volitional verbs. I wish that he would go, or something like that. But there are also a few examples with first or second person subjects, and that really means what the word optative suggests, namely, I wish that X were the case, but it's not, if only X would be or had been the case. So that's a summary of these meanings. If we were to add what I here call categories, and by that I don't mean sort of absolute existential categories, but the way we would characterize these forms by what they mean if we came without any preconceived ideas of what the names of the forms were. Then we would say that these forms here, the imperative, privative, and the optative that ends in ne, represent the category of imperative. And that is very annoying because it means that we're using both the same word for a category and for a member of that category. And we would say that the form that ends in na expresses the category of hortative, which is different from imperative. But it's certainly also very different from the name traditionally given to that form, which is optative, whether it's optative desiderative in English or gambo or kibo in Japanese. That is not really what that form does. And then finally, the forms in namu, they do express wishes, and that is what the word optative means. So we can say that these forms organized in this way express what we would in other circumstances designate by these category names. If we want, well, I would like to, and therefore I propose that a core meaning of these forms is that something be the case. That is common to all of these. I put meaning here, which really means a paraphrase into another language. It's not meaning in the sense of formal semantics, but this is how we would convey what these forms mean in English, for example. If we were doing it in a different language, it would be different. But we have to express what something means in another language, just repeating what is in the original language. So a core meaning, that something be the case. And that core meaning we find very clearly expressed when these forms are embedded. So in this example, Waka wo ni pa shimo napuriso, that frost doesn't fall on their tails, is expressed by this privative form, morphological privative form, but could equally be expressed by an imperative if it was not a negative form or a negative idea. And that is really sort of, I think, the core of what these forms mean. And then there's different variation depending on things like person, volitionality, etc. And I would like to try and explore what these differences are. In main clause use, the core meaning, if we wanted to describe it that way, could be said to be semantically embedded in a frame like I order, urge, advise, encourage, request, hope, want, wish, that something be the case. That's common to all of these forms. And what makes the different forms different is which kind of verb we would choose to express a paraphrase with. Or rather, the verb we would choose to describe a paraphrase with would be different depending on which form it is. So here, for example, this very short word, ko, which means come, expresses all of this. I, and then pick a verb, that you come, be the case. I request that it be the case that you come. I order that it be the case that you come, etc. So actually, these forms are semantically, conceptually quite complex. And sorry, that's just a repetition of the previous summary. Now go on to something which is a little bit of a digression, except that it serves a purpose in what I would like to get at eventually, and that is an introduction of this model of verbal communication by Carl Bühler and Roman Jakobson. And then that will be followed by some kind of application of this model to the forms we're talking about. This is Carl Bühler. He was a German psychologist and linguist who published quite a number of things. He was very important within psychology as well as within linguistics. He worked within Gestalt psychology and is one of the people who developed the idea of figure and ground, which, for example, in linguistics is very important when we want to talk about topicalization. But it's also important in psychology. But he also wrote this book called, in German, Sprachtheorie, which means the theory of language, which is available in English translation from 1990, so much later than the original. I would really encourage everyone who hasn't read this to read, at least look at it. It's a very interesting and foundational book within linguistic theory in a broad sense. It's not something that presents particular ways of describing syntactic trees or morphological analysis or phonological analysis or anything like that, but it really presents some foundations within what is language about. Roman Jakobson is probably known to most people. He was, in my view, by far the greatest linguist of the 20th century and maybe even of all time, who presented so much of what we today take for granted within general linguistic theory, within phonology, within morphology, and so on. He was very influenced by Bühler, and in an article that is known quite well by colleagues in literary studies called Linguistics and Poetics, he developed further Bühler's theory, and so that's why I refer to this as the Bühler-Jakobson model of verbal communication. And I'll give a very, I wouldn't say superficial, but non-exhaustive presentation of what this model is about now and how that can be relevant to our understanding of the forms that I'm talking about today. Very basic element of the model is that verbal communication involves, not at least, but the core of it is three elements: a speaker, a message, and an addressee. So I am presenting a message to you. That's basically what that means, and that's pretty straightforward. A message is in our case, some kind of utterance, a linguistic material, and it could be the cat is on the sofa, for example. That's a perfectly normal message to give somebody in the right circumstances. Then the message needs a context or a reference, something it refers to that can be interpreted by the addressee. Otherwise, it's not a message. It has to have some meaning that can be accessed by the addressee. And for example, if the message is the cat is on the sofa, then it could refer to a cat on a sofa, like here. In terms of the speaker and addressee, one thing Bühler does that as well, but Jakobsen develops very clearly is the idea of how person-deixis works. It's namely a mapping of the participants, the speaker and the addressee in the speech event being the whole communications situation with a speaker, a message, and an addressee. That is, Jakobsen refers to this as a speech event. And so the speaker and the addressee are participants, not necessarily in the message, but in the speech event overall. And it is when we map the speech event onto the message that we get things like personal pronouns. When we have the cat is on the sofa, the speaker or the addressee are not part of this message. Yeah? One is delivering it and the other one is receiving it. But if I say I'm on the sofa, then the pronoun I maps the speaker into the message. And if I say you are on the sofa, then the addressee is mapped into the message. And that's what deixis basically does. It anchors the message in the speech event. It can be as here in person, it can be in time, the here and now of when we're talking, or it could be in place. But that's what deixis does. Jakobsen and Bühler both set up some three basic functions depending on whether the communication event is focused in the context or referent what something means, in the speaker or in the addressee in this way. And they refer to the first one as referential or denotative or cognitive, orientation towards the context here being what the message means or refers to. And that is probably the way we're all conditioned to think of the main function of language. The main function of language is I tell you something like the cat is on the sofa, a declarative sentence, or ask a question, is the cat on the sofa? So it's very content communicatively oriented. However, in actual language use, it's very often not what's the main purpose of saying something. The next function is called emotive or expressive, which is focused on the speaker. It has what Jakobsen says, a direct expression of the speaker's attitude toward what he's speaking about. So if I say, damn, that doesn't have any particular referential content, but it certainly conveys my attitude about something. And that is the emotive or expressive function of language, which probably is very important. The final function is not focused on the context or referent or on the speaker, but on the addressee. And that function is called conative, which means appealing. So the appealing function where the speaker appeals to the addressee. And for example, a vocative form, when Juliet says Romeo, calling Romeo, then that is focused on the addressee, is an appeal to the addressee. And so these three functions are quite important in trying to understand the forms that we're talking about here. I'll just say that the expression of these three different functions, referential or emotive or conative, is in by far the most cases not encoded grammatically. In fact, most utterances exhibit varying degrees of all three functions, and most utterances can be focused within each of the functions, communicated by, for example, different delivery of the function. So, for example, if I say the cat is on the sofa, neutrally, that is a piece of information I'm giving you. If I say it in a different way, the cat is on the sofa, it includes very clearly this emotive function. It can mean, how amazing, the cat is on the sofa. So it's not that it only has this emotive function, but it focuses on that through my delivery. I can say, the cat is on the sofa. That's really horrible. Or I can, in a conative example, say, the cat is on the sofa, meaning don't sit on the sofa, you'll just disturb the cat. Or if I say, the cat is on the sofa, get him off the sofa. So it's not, these functions are not usually encoded directly in the grammar of the language, but can be conveyed by delivery. And so on that note, we return to the Old Japanese, namely the application of this model of verbal communication to these forms and what that can tell us about what they, in my opinion, actually are used for and mean. As it says here, the application of this will consist in trying to understand or trying to persuade you that these three sets of forms, the imperative, prohibitive, and optative forms, can be understood in terms of these functions as direct primary and specialized grammatical encoding of the emotive and the conative functions. So whereas when these functions are found in actual language use, they're not directly grammatically encoded, but I think the forms we're talking about have as an important, very important part of what they do, a direct grammatical encoding of these functions. And I'll try to show you what I mean by this. Jakobsen did a somewhat similar type of analysis of the Russian verb in an also quite well-known article from 1971, which is called Shifter's Verbal Categories and the Russian Verb, but arrives at some slightly different conclusions, or somewhat different conclusions with respect to some of the usages. This is the summary, just to remind us, that I showed you before. I will be using the words imperative, hortative, and optative, and I'll be writing them in capital letters on the slides, not because I want to shout, but just to say that that's when I'm talking about these categories as established earlier. So imperative refers to these three sets of forms. Hortative refers to the form that ends in na. And then finally, optative refers to the form that ends in namu. And of course, that's confusing that some of these words, imperative, optative, are also used as the labels or names we have for the forms. But it's very difficult to get around that. This was the core meaning, I said, of what these forms have in common in their meaning, that something be the case. That something should, would, could be the case. No, that something should be the case. And just talking first about what I think is actually the simplest of these forms, namely the form that ends in namu. In this example, which is the full example, I didn't put all of it earlier. Wakimo pa koromo ni aranamu. If only my beloved were a garment, then I could have worn her underneath in this cold autumn wind, but she's not, so I can't. What this, to me, seems to express is very much the speaker's attitude to what he's speaking about. It would be wonderful if it were the case that my beloved is a garment. So that's also, I think, what the word optative, wishing, means. And that's really, I think, simply what the optative in namu is. It's an emotive form, and we can understand it in terms of that function. But going on to the imperative and hortative, I think they are not the opposite, but they are grammatical encoding of the conative function. And that's not something I've just made up, but Jakobsen says that the conative function finds its purest grammatical expression in the vocative and imperative, and we've already seen an example of the vocative, Romeo, and so he also talks about the imperative in this context. But I think we can probably really milk that completely to try and understand all the uses of the imperative and hortative forms. When people who work on imperatives and hortatives talk about them, they will often say that there are canonical imperatives which have a second person subject, and there are canonical hortatives which has a second and a first person subject, and then the uses where the imperative form has a third person subject is a non-canonical imperative. And where the hortative has a first person singular subject, that's a non-canonical hortative form. So I'll first talk about the imperatives, looking briefly at the canonical forms, and then see how we can understand the non-canonical third-person subject forms. And then the same with the hortatives. Very simply, this example we've seen a number of times, punit kase, lend me a boat, is the speaker appealing to the addressee that it be the case that you lend me a boat. And we have the addressee figuring as the subject inside the thing that should be the case. That's a very straightforward way of thinking about and understanding imperatives. And so that accounts for this canonical imperative, and that's also, for example, the way Jakobsen would describe that, and probably most other people. Now, if we turn to the third person subject imperatives, it's not quite as obvious how this works. I've repeated a number of the examples here. Yanagui mori ni paya nare. May the willow trees quickly grow into a forest. Momiti paya tukie. May the momiti follow on quickly after some flowers have fallen. May the footprints of the Buddha remain forever. And may the white clouds of heaven give us rain, using the ne form. And then another example, white azalea, may they rub off on my clothes. And with the privative, may there not be a low tide, may the night not dawn, and may the storm not blow. How can we understand these forms as conative forms that include an appeal to the addressee? Because there's no addressee reflected inside that something be the case here. And that's, for example, where Jakobsen and other people say that, well, that's just an extension of the use of the imperative form. But I think we can understand this as an addressee appeal. And actually, I think third-person imperatives encode something like what we would call in English an invocation in a religious context. And I'm not saying that these contexts are religious, but it's the same kind of idea. An invocation is the action or act of invoking or calling upon a god, a deity in prayer or attestation. And I think what we can think about, the way to understand these forms, like arashi napukiso, is that we appeal to a higher authority, I call it, because I don't want to say that all these are necessarily religious authorities, but whoever is in charge of the weather, let there not be a storm. And if we adopt that point of view, then actually these are also conative forms, but the addressee is different from the subject inside the clause that should be that should be the case. So there's no representation of the addressee in here, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an addressee. And I think that is a revealing way of understanding what these forms mean, because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these forms, if you look at the Gendai Goyaku of the text from this period, go out of their way to interpret the subject of the verb, so here arashi, as a vocative, which really doesn't make much sense. Whereas if we interpret it in this way, we can see that it makes far more sense that you appeal to whoever's in charge, whatever is in charge, of making that happen or here not happen. Turning to the hortatives, canonical hortatives have a first and a second and a first person subject. So here, the full example, it is today, my dear friends, that also people in China are said to have fun floating boats. So let's us wear flower crowns to have some fun. Yeah. And we can understand that as the speaker appealing to the addressee that we do something together. So it includes both the speaker and the addressee. And I try to color that in purple, which I think is what you get if you mix red and blue. So that's one way of representing that. I think we can actually get a better understanding of what it is, but for now, that is probably the most common way of thinking about hortatives, that they include an appeal to the addressee, but that the speaker is included in the subject of the proposition that should be the case. If we turn to non-canonical hortatives, so hortatives that have a first-person singular subject, such as this one we've seen a number of times, ware mo suswo nurasana, let me wet the hem of my skirt, or here, let me get wet. Then how do we, if we can, and I think we can, the question is, how do we interpret that as a connotative expression? Who is the addressee here? Because the speaker is the I. I think an example I found, which I haven't shown earlier, is one that shows quite clearly what is probably, in my view, going on. This is a poem by Yakamochi, who, it says in the head note, the introduction to the poem, in the Manyoshu, that he's ill, he's lying in bed, and he's kind of thinking to himself. Life in this world is ephemeral. Let me pursue the way, so miti, so the way of the Buddha, while looking at the mountains and the rivers. Who's he talking to? I think he's talking to himself. Yeah. And if we say that, then the addressee here is actually the speaker. And that's, I think, the way of understanding these first-person singular hortatives. Not that they just mean, I want to do something, I will do something, which is really not a connotative expression. So you could think, which is what Jacobsen thought, well, we have this connotative form, and now we're using it to say, I want to do something. But I think it's not like that, at least in the Old Japanese. I think an example like this one very plausibly means that he's talking to himself. Let me do something. And so when the speaker is the addressee, we get a first-person addressee, because that is really the speaker, who is certainly the speaker, but also is addressing him or herself. That means we can probably extend that to the hortatives that have a second and a first-person subject, namely we, the subject. Namely that also in these cases, the speaker is talking to himself or herself and another, the other that is present in the situation. But it means that these are connotative utterances which appeal to the addressee, which is a composite of the speaker and something other. Well, not something other, someone other. And I think that's sort of nearing the end, getting to a conclusion which I'll present here in another chart, which has some of the same elements as the earlier one, but is quite different. It has the same three categories: imperative, comprising the morphological imperative, prohibitive, and the form that ends in ne; the hortative, form that ends in na; and the optative, the form that ends in namu. Here on the very left, it classifies these in terms of whether the function these express is a connotative or emotive function within the Bühler-Jacobsen framework, the optative being emotive, and that's just examples here on the far right of the ones we've seen many times. And then trying to break down what the differences between the imperative and hortative are. The imperative has as an addressee not the speaker. The speaker is not included in the addressee. whereas the hortatives are plus speaker, have the speaker included in the addressee. The difference between second person subject imperatives, the ones that are the most common, and the canonical one is that the addressee is not a higher authority. It is simply the other person you're talking to. Whereas with the third person subject imperatives, the subject is different from the addressee, and the addressee is what I call, for want of a better word, a higher authority. For the hortatives, the addressee always includes the speaker, usually together with the other, another, in which case we get the let us do something meaning, and we get a subject, which is a first and second person subject, which is the same as the addressee, or it does not include the other, in which case it's only the speaker, so still the subject and the addressee are the same, but it's a first person singular, so it means let me do something. In some languages you will, if you address yourself, not use me, let me, you say, why don't you do that when you talk to yourself? So that is, I think, the way in which these forms differ from each other. We can classify them semi-formally in this way and get a sense of why we get the different meanings we get in different circumstances, and still maintain that these are forms that have as their core meaning that something be the case. But the meaning is then articulated differently, either in a conative or emotive way, and if conative, depending on whether the addressee includes the speaker or does not include the speaker, and so on and so on. That's all I wanted to say. I think this has some implications for how, for example, we should translate Old Japanese into other languages. We should not try to force an overt vocative onto third-person subject imperatives. We should not try to think of the first-person singular subject hortatives, when the form ends in na, as meaning I want to do something. It's an exhortation to yourself to do something. I'll finish with a slide which is a poem composed by Yakamochi. It's the very last poem in the Manyoshu, presented at a New Year party on the first day of the year 759. And it has a wonderful third-person imperative. It's also a kind of New Year greeting. And I know it's not quite New Year yet, but I think it's close enough to include here. And it says here, like the snow that's falling today on the first day of the new year, let them pile up in plenty good things. It's not an address to the good things to pile up. It's an address to some higher authority to let good things pile up. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.